for Q&A. So as I said, either put it in the chat. First question from Dan. Dan Zeman.
Yes, sorry. Hi, I'm not sure. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Good. Can you hear me? Can you see me? All good? All right. So hi everyone. Hi Saray. Thanks so much for this talk. I have a question that I mean, it's a little bit naive, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's not what you. Maybe it pertains to the way you expressed the view that you're proposing. So it seems to me the way it came out, at least to me, that you put like all the bad things with the essentialist interpretation of a generic, like all the bad things, what do you call the bad things, and then all the good things with the kind of social, the kind of like social position interpretation of a generic. And I'm wondering whether that's so, because I mean, even if you take the sentence that you gave, women have. Somebody could say women have troubles getting high-level positions, thankfully, or and that's how it should be, or something like that, like kind of revealing the fact that they think that this is how it should be, or something. So this kind of suggests that it's not just the mere interpretation of a generic as pertaining, as invoking some social structure or something that makes it, makes it fall in like in the good or the bad condition. Sorry, in the bad and the good category. So which means to me it suggests that there should be some other element to the explanation that should be added. I don't know. Does it make sense? Does the question make sense? Or
so are you? Thank you, Dan. So are you saying that sometimes we're gonna face speakers saying,
yeah,
uttering a generic to actually mean what it seems they mean?
Yes, and I mean, so you contrasted the generic interpretation, the social structure interpretation. I'm saying there might be cases in which somebody uses the generic to, point it, fully aware that that's a social structure that they're that's behind the generic. They're kind of endorsing it or something, and they don't have to do it because they're essentialist or something. Maybe somebody just thinks that's the best way of arranging society. We must to get into the position, high-level position or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I think I see what you mean. What cases you mean. I mean, I guess that's something that I think it goes more in the area of how to react or how to counter speech. When we are in front of someone saying something problematic, and I don't know how much. I don't know in those cases how much we need to actually figure out the intention of the speaker. Do we need to first make sure that this person actually believes that this is the best way to arrange society? Or I would say, I don't care. I need to intervene just because that's something bad to say. So I'm gonna counter speech with something, maybe by clarification of the structural generics. Oh, you mean that women actually have a lot of obstacle? And then, it's not then that could be a different kind of conversation, right? But versus someone who is just saying the generic without committing themselves with some specific interpretation. So I'm only talking about these other cases. In the case you are mentioning, I'd say I think it's a case more for, I would say, for Bianca about, how do you respond to that kind of someone who is saying something so bad, like the cases that she has been showing. So I don't think that would be a case specific for, I don't think it matters that they are pronouncing a generic in particular. So I'm more interested in the other cases where someone is saying a generic statement without necessarily committing themselves to one interpretation or the other, but they are conveying the essentialist interpretation, given all we know from psychology. I don't know if this answers your question at all.
Yeah. Got it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Question from Liz.
Hi, thank you. So I feel really strongly sympathetic to your view, and I had my proposal, and it's like, wait, but that's her proposal. And so so that I'm very much so. But in a way, following up on Dan's question, one of the things I think is really just interesting about generics, and also makes them very tricky in these kinds of contexts, is sorting out what is in the truth conditions of the speech act, of the sentence and the speech act itself, and what is merely implicated or conveyed or whatever in context, right? And so some people have the intuition that the actual truth values of these sentences are shifting across these contexts of utterance. And other people are saying, and I would say that in my reaction is often, well, I agree with what you're saying, but I know that I'm disagreeing with the reason you're saying it and what the, what else you would be bringing in if you were to. So one question for you is, do you think it's relevant to try to sort out the semantics from the pragmatics in that way, to see whether they're shifting across different contexts? If you think the truth value of the utterance itself is false, then that suggests one way of challenging or engaging. If you think it's merely conveyed, that's suggests a different mode of engaging. Or maybe that's all just irrelevant and really we should be thinking about like just the socio-political dynamics of the actual circumstances, as they play out. So yeah, it's a kind of, I guess it's a question about where you think the most fruitful avenues of theoretical analysis for you are, where I'm basically coming with total agreement about the kind of variability we see. One of the reasons generics are so powerful for good and for ill. The cognitive, you've diagnosed aptly the cognitive situation, and often much part of the way the conversations actually play out. How much do like the particular linguistic constructions matter, sorting that out matter, and how much does that matter to the practical engagement, the ways we want to actually respond?
Well,
does that make sense?
Hello, I don't thank you very much. I need to think. I've been trying not to get into the meaning. I mean, I admit, I confess, I get lost about the meaning of genetics and the semantics. I've been trying to stay away from that and just thinking about pragmatics, because, and I mean, I have an easy excuse. I could say that's all I think it matters if you are trying to make a better language along the lines of, moral and political, to have a language that doesn't convey oppression and doesn't convey essentialist beliefs that we know are so bad. So I guess my answer is, I don't know. And but I think your question, yeah, I think to have a more serious proposal, let me say, put it that way, if that doesn't sound too modest, I should say something about what's weird or interesting about the meaning of genetics. I don't know even how to put it, but I would say I have no idea.
Can I make a quick follow-up? Sort of,
I don't know. That's me highlighting.
Just I think so. My own feeling is, yeah, I mean, generics are a mess, right? And but in a really interesting way. I sort of share your sympathy. You may not want to or need to get into the details of a semantic analysis, but it might be worth looking more systematically at how these different contexts vary, about what kinds of how strong is the convey. You talking about become something being conveyed, right? How strong is that, and in what ways and what kinds of responses are available to participants in conversations across variation, and trying to discern some systematicity to that, even if, and then just like saying, okay, if you want to call that pragmatics or semantics, I don't really care, but here are the sort of systematic dimensions of variation that we would want to, so that seem useful. Here are the system, as systematic as you can get it. And here are sort of the constraints on how people can respond, and how it seems super useful to respond. And then maybe that's actually providing illumination for a semantic analysis, maybe not, but but I think, yeah, that is my next sort of natural step in thinking through this kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I will think about this. Thank you very much.
Oh, So next question from Bianca.
Thanks a lot, Saray, for the great talk. I am curious about something concerning. So I was thinking about the moment where you compare the macho and the activist uttering the very same generics, and it was kind of easy for us to understand what they could have meant, right? And then I was thinking, what kind of elements, what kind of factors help us interpreting? And the way you put it, of course, it would be the speaker's identity, right? But then we can think of cases where it's really not the speaker identity that lead our interpretation, but rather our own perspective. So I think that an interesting phenomenon is that what you think makes one interpretation salient rather than the other. And this is interesting because then you have the responsibility of what the generics provokes in your line of thought. And no, nothing. I just wanted you to comment on this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, as in that case, as you say, when we see that generic, like for this audience, that generic would be, everyone was already thinking about, maybe the interpretation that maybe I'm trying to provoke. Yeah, but that's actually the puzzle is always, right? If you already have the structural interpretation in mind, should you assent to someone uttering a social generic? Like, if you suspect that maybe if you know that your interpretation maybe is a minority interpretation, this is actually making me think about. So Sterken has a recent paper, a chapter in a book about proposing a specific linguistic intervention that she calls, I think, transformative linguistic intervention. And she said, so if we already have meanings, like ameliorated meanings that we know are better for our language, and she talks about the example of woman, a meaning of woman that is inclusive of trans women. So she said, why she proposes as an intervention to speak as if the word already means the ameliorated meaning, even though you know that that's not the case, that the majority of people you are talking to have a different meaning in mind. So she said, this is going to cause a lot of misunderstandings. This is going to cause disorientation. But she thinks that this is good because it's going to provoke reflection in your interlocutor about the language. It's like, oh, wait a minute, something is going on here. So at least you're going to make people think about how they are using language and how you are using language, and maybe reflect. So that's, I mean, it probably has also problems. I think it's pretty cool. So I'm thinking, if you already know that your interpretation of generics is a minority interpretation, should you just keep using generics and talk to other people in generic, or send when someone uses a generic, react as if, that's okay? Or should you just make sure that you are triggering the right generic, or saying, I'm assenting to your generic, but only because I take it as a structure? I mean, I don't know, but I think it's very interesting to see about how, when linguistic interventions, if we want to cause this disorientation and misunderstanding, if that's already something we are comfortable with, at least for a while, until, to make people reflect, or we should avoid at all cost misunderstanding or being not good collaborators in the conversation. I don't know what to say.
Thanks a lot.
Any other questions? I can't see anyone in the chat. You can raise your hand or... Okay, Liz.
Sorry. So just going back to one more, to this situation of, and this is something Sally has talked a lot about agreeing and not agreeing with things that are about a particular generic and things that are off the table, right? So I find it useful to think about, I just want to talk through a specific example and to think about, and I'm not sure exactly, I think I'm suspicious that there's like a general recipe for what to do in engaging with these kinds of conversations, but I want to talk about this like one example. So Sally's example is women are submissive, right? And so there's part of you might want to just be like, no, and then, but then there's another thing you might want to say, which is like, well, yeah, but in the sense that they're disposed, unbalanced, if you look at, the population, but not for the reason I think you think, right? So to accept, in going back to the empirical research of your collaborator, not just this is true as a statistical generalization, and not just that this is true as a matter of a structural explanation. I'm going along with you with the certain kind of essentialist, the biological essentialist, in that far, right? I think there's a structural explanation for this. I might even think that it's, I might be going, quite even another step further about sort of like given facts about bodies and gestation and breastfeeding, right? It's going to be a lot easier. They're like deep, partly biological structures in place that are going to make it easy to, have this kind of set up a society in which this is going to be a dominant mode of engagement, right? But you're valorizing that and you're thinking that that's a good thing and I want to reject that. Or you're thinking this is deeply biologically, grounded and I want to reject that, right? So I want to say that there's a way in which the kind of agreement that you might want to have with somebody who endorses women are submissive, who's coming out of like, I don't know, some conservative think tank or something. The kind of agreement you might have with them is very deep degree of agreement, right? It might be with a generalization, a structural explanation, something in which biology might even be relevant, but there's still a very deep and strong disagreement possible, right? If that's the kind of case that we're talking about, and of course your own judgments about those things might get off the boat from mine, much earlier, but if that's the kind of case we're talking about, and I think there are analogous cases for, race or whatever, it takes a lot of engagement to diagnose and uncover that point of disagreement. And it takes a lot of like going along with somebody whose motives and commitments I find deeply repugnant. So I guess I don't know. That's part of why I am in a conversation like that. I am conflicted about whether I agree or don't agree, because I think there is often a significant degree of agreement. And I, may be useful, but that doesn't preclude that, there's this really important disagreement. So does that make, yeah, there's a risk of talking about a particular case, but I wanted to think about that particular case as an example of the sense in which is this agreement or non-agreement, and then I'm imputing to somebody some thoughts that they probably never had explicitly, right? I'm sorting out a bunch about what the structural explanation is and what the ground of the structural explanation is, in a way that I think it's a very like philosophers kind of thing to do, and ordinary people don't typically do.
Well, there are several things I would love to comment to, but I'm going to focus on one, which is how much, if I got you right, one of the things you are talking is how much agreement or disagreement can I have with someone I want to counter speech to? I want to say something about. I want to at least I want to protest what they are saying in some way, or quantify or something.
I just to be clear, I want to say like there's maybe two things to distinguish here. One is like if we just took a set of our epistemic situations, our cognitive and epistemic situations, and like diagnosed where there is agreement and disagreement, how much agreement or disagreement would there be? The other thing is in a conversation, the dynamics and especially the pragmatics of the conversation, how is it useful to proceed and what would it be good to do, right? And I guess what I was talking about, there might in fact be a huge amount of substantive agreement if you take that diagnostic thing, but I really don't want to let that get into, that seems like a different issue from, it informs, but it needs to be kept distinct from how I actually engage in the conversation, right? If I want to effectively block them or resist them or convince them or, any of the various things that
I don't know what to say. I mean, again, there's so many things that you are making me think about. one thing that I'm thinking about for that other question that I didn't explore that is, how should we use, or how should we respond to genetics as if we want to use some kind of counter speech when we are in front of someone uttering a genetic, is whether when we re-explain a genetic, is that a request for explicitation or unpacking? As you know, as Bianca was talking about, this first part of blocking is, unpack. What do you mean there? Make explicit what you are saying, as if we suspect that what that person is assuming we don't agree with, right? And we want to make sure that there is a disagreement there. Or maybe when we re-explain, we are not even challenging the person assumptions, or we are not even questioning, you have an implicit assumption here about women's nature. Maybe we're just worried, and this is something, maybe I'm very selfish, I don't know. I'm just, happens to me when I'm talking to someone and saying, some things, like, I don't even care what you think. I just want to make sure that in this conversation, we don't say awful things. I just don't want to have my hands dirty about, in awful conversations. So maybe it's like, I'm not challenging what you think. I'm not even assuming that you have some implicit beliefs about essences of women. I just want to make sure that what we say in this conversation is not conveying any awful thing, just in case someone is, listening. So in that case, maybe disagreement or diagnosis of disagreement is not even relevant. I just want to make sure that the genetics that you are saying, that the structural interpretation is out there, maybe because I'm thinking all the time about, possible observers, conversations that happen in front of many people. So yeah, I would just comment that. But thank you very much. There is a lot to think about there.
That's wonderful exchange here. So we have a question from Sandy.
So thanks so much for, again, a really, really thoughtful and interesting conversation, one that really gives me a lot to think about. I think I'm following up with something that you yourself remarked on and was a theme in some of the other comments. So you pointed out early on that it may well be a psychological default that we interpret generics in terms of the essentialist interpretation. My question for you is, I'm just inviting you to help me think about this, because I tend to, I like in epistemology, I like to think about our responsibilities vis-a-vis our own implicit biases. So if it really is a psychological default, it suggests that the response to this kind of thing would be akin to the kind of response to implicit biases. I'm wondering, do you think it matters to how we intervene whether or not it is a psychological default? And if it does, how does the fact that it is a psychological default, the essentialist reading, how does that affect how we think about it, how we intervene, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think it matters because if there is a psychological default in sense, and following Sarah Jane Leslie, but it seems to be really primitive. I think she uses the word primitive cognitive mechanism that we use to generalize and categorize, and it's super cool. It's great that we have that capacity to generalize right away with a few items and categorize, and that saves our lives many times, right? We are really good, but it has these other awful consequences. So I think if we know that from psychology, then we need to tailor our linguistic interventions to that, because we might have interventions that are totally gonna be fighting, a wall, are gonna be fighting ingrained psychological mechanisms that is not a good idea. So I think, and in that, I mean, this idea of using instead of quantified statements, we see that people still remember them as generics. That is telling us something, that we need to change our interventions. We need to do something else. So I think by keeping generics, even if they didn't have the benefits that Richie points out, as they are good at capturing the systematicity of injustice, by keeping generics, we are not messing with our, this psychological mechanism, but we can, find, a way to, okay, yeah, let's keep our genetic. We can keep saying women are submissive. If what we have in mind or what we are conveying is, look at all this obstacle that women face because the social position women occupy, place them in these constrained landscapes. So I think we do have to look at what psychology is telling us about how we think generalizations and conceptualizations in order to think about our linguistic interventions and how to improve our language. Thank you for your question.
Right, we have, I think, another 5 minutes. So, Ray. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure which question to ask. One of them is about essentialism. So I really like what you're saying here, and I really enjoyed the talk very much. I confess that even though I think the essentialism point is important, it's not necessary to the dangers of generics. And the reason I'm interested in this is, well, first of all, the most sexist teacher I ever had way back at the University of Sydney, David Stove, who was actually writing articles about how feminism is bringing down the universities, was a thoroughgoing empiricist who didn't believe in any sort of essences, and law-like regularities were completely sufficient to get the whole framework off the ground. Anyway, so my paradigm cases of old school sexists were in fact non-essentialist, and since I've started thinking about that in connection with the generics literature, it occurs to me that okay, so everyone says barns are red is the paradigm case of a non-essentialist true generic, but you know, if you are building your barn in New England and you're about to paint it purple or orange, and your neighbor comes up and says, hey, barns are red, you know, you're going to feel the normative force of that, even though there's nothing essential about barns being red. So I just think the whole thing is just, we're pinning too much on essentialism. There's so much more sort of social normativity in weaker sorts of law-like associations. And we should just, you know, there's no need to, you know, tie our flag to this neo-Aristotelian mast, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, it's just an interesting aspect to the whole debate that I think could anyway. This isn't as I thought. I loved what you were saying, but this is just a comment on the essentialism part.
Thank you, Ray. By the way, I'm very happy to see you. It's been a long time. Yeah,
Great
thank you very much.
You too, Saray. I haven't. Yeah, it's been years since I've seen you, and now it does really feel like I'm seeing you again. It's fantastic, as well as everyone else who's here, many of whom I haven't seen for ages. Okay, yeah, great. All right, I'll switch my mic off now.
So yeah, there is. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I mean, my first reaction and my happiness when my collaborator found out, you know, was working on doing the studies and finding out that there is an alternative non-essentialist interpretation that is possible, that is it's not cognitively super demanding. It's so easy. Like children do it as soon as 3 years old. Adults, like, it's so easy to cue this structural interpretation of genetics. That was a warning of maybe we've been too scared of, you know, essentialist. Conveying essentialism, maybe it's not that common. Maybe the problem is somewhere else. But still, my hope is that by not conveying essentialism, we are doing something good with genetics. But then I guess the next step would be with genetics like barns are red. What to do with the normative force if we get rid of the essentialist. Imagine that we live in a world in 10 years, everyone thinks structurally about genetics. Maybe the question would be, could we still have the problems that we have when we utter genetics? Probably we will have still sexism and everything, bad things, but maybe we wouldn't blame genetics. Maybe that's the only work I'm doing. That's sad anyway. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions in the last minute left? If not, I think we should give a round of applause to Saray for a wonderful talk. Thank you. So we are reconvening in 10 minutes with